Linda Reynolds, welcome to Lessons in Leadership.
It's a pleasure to join you.
It's great to be over here talking to, it turns out, 4 Western Australian Ministers for Defence over recent years, Linda. Tell us, how did you become Minister for Defence?
Well, I became Minister for Defence. I'd spent quite a bit of time with the Prime Minister when I was the Assistant Minister for Emergency Management and Customs and other issues in the Home Affairs portfolio. So I spent quite a lot of time with the Prime Minister, and I got to show him, unknowingly at the time, but really what I could do in terms of disaster management, emergency relief and leadership. And I was with him on the day that Steve Chobo told him that he was going to be retiring at the next election. And the very next day, the PM had me in Canberra swearing me into Cabinet, into the Defence Industry Ministry. And he said at the time, and he said publicly, that when we won, not if we won, but when we won, I'd be the Defence Minister. And he was true to his word.
Yes. You're unusual in the sense that you had a sort of almost a long preparation for the position. And what I'm referring to by that, of course, is that you had a military career rising to the rank of brigadier. How did that impact on your thinking and your preparation for the job?
Well, on reflection, my background and history prepared me very well for this role for the last 2 years as the nation's Defence Minister. And it's not necessarily the positions that you hold, but it's really all about how they shape you and how they prepare you for life and for new roles. And my time both in the military, in the army, but also my time in politics, I think also shaped me very well. So I had the opportunity to, in fact, I was the first reservist to go to the Command and Staff course. So and spent 12 months there at what is now the War College. And so doing those strategic studies really prepared me very well to take on this role. But unknowingly at the time, I did my dissertation, my master's dissertation, in reform in defence. I started off being very interested in understanding, during my time working as a senior officer, as a colonel in defence and army, why we kept going through cycles of totally unproductive reform. They're a bit like herds of elephants sort of sweeping across defence, never being fully implemented and never really realising any change before the next round of reforms. So I wanted to really understand why that happened and how we could possibly break out of that, not thinking at the time that one day I'd be the Minister for Defence. So I did this dissertation and I went right back to pre-Federation to having a look at the structures and the processes and how our Defence Force came together at Federation, some of the issues that they imported and some of the battles with the United Kingdom. And really then how we grew and changed. And it was really clear to me that a number of trends over time were repeating themselves over and over. So for example, in terms of acquisition capability, there has never been a golden age of defence acquisition, and there's always been constant government disappointment and public disappointment in that material side of defence. And in fact, the 1915 Anderson Review was almost identical to the observations of the the First Principles Review. So it was really interesting to see these trends over and over and how, and again, I think once I got to understand the issues at Federation about the Defence Act, you know, where did primacy sit? Was it in London? Was it in Australia? Was it with the monarchy? Was it with the government of the day? And some of those tensions have sort of really reverberated sort of through the history, and the tensions between the CDF, or variously named, the Secretary, the Minister and the Prime Minister, are constant thematics as battles for power. Yeah. And a lot of the restructuring that was done was actually to restructure the balance internally between public servants, and also between the military, but also the political leaders of the day. So it was a very dynamic history. And so my conclusion at the end of that was that we had never fully implemented any white paper or fully funded and actually delivered. So my conclusions were quite obvious when you say them out aloud, but that we needed the strategy to deal with not only today, but where we see our geostrategic circumstances evolving, where technology is evolving. So you need the right strategy and it needs to be recalibrated regularly. Yep. You then need to have the right force structure plan, the capability plan to deliver that. But that in itself is still not enough. You then need to have the organisation, the defence enterprise, which has driven, I think, many a departmental secretary mad, trying to harness and to do that in harmony with the military side of defence with the ADF. So you needed the enterprise itself, one that was capable of actually delivering the strategy and the capability requirements. So that was very clear to me, but it was also very clear that you needed the budget, because if you have a look at the history, and I'm sure some of my predecessors would also be frustrated that they had plans, but then the funding was cut or things weren't delivered as we expected them to be. So transformation was important, but so was the budget. So I went into the role with a very clear idea of what I wanted to achieve in my tenure. I had a 3-year plan, but I got to implement two of those 3 years. And I'm very proud of what I did and what we did together with Defence during an incredibly challenging time for the world, for our nation, and also for our Defence forces.
So Linda, I want to walk through a number of those big issues that happened during your time as Minister, but let me just ask a little bit more about the beginning of it. I mean, you have just described a conservative organisation, which has been one of the great departments of state since Federation, pretty firm in its views about how it should do things. How did that impact on you as you come in with a change agenda and also some pretty, considered and thought through ideas about what it is that you wanted to do?
I came in again with some advantage of having the opportunity to think about this and think very deeply about it before I came into this, to the ministry, which is quite unusual. You don't always get that opportunity. So I think there's two parts to that. The first one was that in Army, I had done I'd led 3 very large change programs. So I got to progressively understand how to change the organisation from within, where the resistance came from. So as I did each project, and again, they were Army-wide, so I got to understand how to achieve reform within Army, but again, that was nestled within, these were all transformation programs, change programs, organisation-wide. So I went into that dissertation really wanting to understand the environment that I had been operating in and how to achieve reform. Again, not with the intent of being the Defence Minister, but at the time then going back into Army and into Defence to leverage off that knowledge. So the second really is an issue of gender. I'm somebody who spent a large part of my career in the military and in the Liberal Party, working very hard, and with ASPI on issues of gender and gender empowerment. So my own gender journey started during and after the Skype incident. I, at the time, was out at Western Creek at the college, but I was asked by the then Chief of Army, David Morrison, to join his gender diversity board. Somewhat ironically, I was the only female on the board at the time. It was his CASAC. But I understand things have progressed a long way since then. But really the turning point for me was participating in a focus group that Elizabeth Broderick held, so with 06, so with colonel equivalent women across the 3 services. And it was one of the most profoundly sad things And I'll remember every discussion we had, I think, till the day I die, because it had such a profound impact on me. In that sitting there, so some of the women hadn't even turned up, and Elizabeth Broderick was a bit surprised, well, why? And some of the other women were just sitting there like this, like, I don't want to be here. And so Elizabeth asked, and there was one woman from another service who just said, I don't want to be seen as a woman. I don't want to talk about being a woman. I just want to put my head down and keep doing my job. Things that we've all heard from women, and I've certainly heard throughout my career. But it just dawned on me, what have we done to women in this organisation that they don't want to be seen as a woman? What is wrong with being seen as a woman? What is wrong leading as a woman? These are some of the most capable women in our nation, and they wanted to deny their own gender identity. And that was profoundly shocking to me. And the more I started thinking about it and then looking with new eyes at the issue of gender, I realised that to fit in the military and in the Liberal Party, I had, like I think probably every other woman, adopted the behaviours, masculine behaviours to get by. And I describe it now as like an ill-fitting mantle that you go to work with, and just going to feel uncomfortable. You're not quite sure why. And then after a time, you just forget to take it off when you go home. So that completely changed. And going through that whole process of understanding unconscious bias, understanding process and change and transformation was very empowering for me, because it was then that I found my voice as a female leader. And it's not always easy. Because, I do speak differently, I do think differently, I do have different ways of achieving things, as many women do. But actually having that opportunity to really find my own voice as a female leader was a turning point for me. And finding my voice in the military, within defence, again, gave me, I think, well prepared me for working in that environment.
So, Linda, I find that fascinating, and I also think to myself, having worked in ministers' offices, that these are hard, pretty unforgiving places. Frankly, there's always there's 6 difficult issues a day. Finding time to be able to sort of think clearly about what you want to do, the differences that you want to make, that's hard enough. And then you sort of raise this question of, well, how can you be authentically you as a female and as a Minister for Defence in that environment? By the time you got into the role, so that's now, I suppose, a decade or so from the ADFA Skype incident that you referred to, Liz Broderick's review of the ADF. Were you happy with your ability to sort of play that authentic role inside the department as the minister at that stage? Had we moved on in 10 years? Or
a lot has changed within Defence and within the ADF. But I think as the Brereton Review and the issues with the Special Forces, which they've been on a sort of 5-year journey to reform, demonstrates that there is still a long way to go culturally within the broader defence, but not just the ADF, but particularly the ADF. So we've come a long way. And one of the wonderful things now is that while I was the first female brigadier in the Army Reserves, I'm certainly, there's many more behind me, and there's now more, above me in terms of rank. And the wonderful thing is there are so many women who are now doing things as women. It is much easier to have a career and have a family and deploy as a woman. And it is now much easier to do that. And you have a look, there's an amazing diversity of these most amazing women who are getting opportunities to command forces overseas as well as here in Australia. And they are doing a magnificent job.
Does the tone and the calibre of cabinet change when there are more senior women around the cabinet table?
I suspect so. And certainly listening to, some of the things that Julie Bishop has had to say about her experience, sort of her lonely experience. But, one of the many wonderful things about the current Prime Minister, which I don't think people give him enough credit for, is that he's had 6 and now 7 again women in Cabinet. And all of us are there on merit. We're there because we are all very good at what we do. And we work very well together. We're quite different. I mean, we're very different women, different backgrounds, different views on life. But one of the many, lovely things experience over the last few years is the support of my female colleagues. Yes. And, we do talk about issues and about supporting each other, not just each other, but I don't think, because there's been so few women in leadership across so many professions, we don't have that history of working together and collaborating in ways that many men do. So that it's been a wonderful experience. And in recent times, not only has the Prime Minister been incredibly supportive, but so have many of my cabinet colleagues, particularly my female colleagues.
Of course, you were the second female Defence Minister. Did Marise Payne give you any advice about this job that you were taking on?
She didn't so much give me advice, but the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister, by the very nature of their jobs, have to work very closely together. Yes. And I've known the Foreign Minister now, and we've been friends for many, several decades. And she has, again, provided a lot of support and a lot of wise advice, and we just work very closely together, as did our officers.
Now, I want to go through again some of the big issues that were sort of on your plate, as it were, during your time as Minister. And let's start with the bushfires and the enormous conflagration that really burnt its way through the east coast of the country shortly after the election. You found yourself, as you've said, working very closely with the Prime Minister, also thinking about new ways that support could be provided to all of those communities that were under threat. What were some of the things that sort of formed part of your consideration for dealing with that bushfire crisis?
Well, early on, in late sort of November, before the Black Summer fires, in January, I had spent a lot of time working with Defence and with the CDF, working through what ifs. So what if we did need to call out, because we were expecting a bad season, catastrophic bushfires in the predictions. So it was really about contingency planning. And so one of the first things we did is we actually did a trial call out of the reserves. It was a very good thing we did, because it was a very clunky and slow process, the trial. So when we unfortunately had to do it for real, it was done very, very quickly. And we were able to mobilise reserves for the first time as a call-out, not a call for, so a compulsory call-out. So there were still lessons that were learnt from that process, but it worked incredibly well. So we'd done a lot of the planning before then. So there were so many lessons learnt within Defence, and again, lessons for me and for the government, because it really demonstrated that I made sure that we pushed out public affairs across the operations. So it was wonderful to see that Australians, I think, got more of a sense of the capabilities and who some of the people were. That there's not just people who were on operations in the other side of the world, but these were real Australians who had great capabilities and great passion for their nation. But it was also really clear that Australians expected the Defence Forces to do more in times of very large national crises that were beyond the capability of states and territories to deliver. So it very quickly became the largest ever domestic mobilisation of the Defence Forces in our nation's history, exponentially larger than Cyclone Tracy. And again, it was done very well, and not just with us, but with the many nations who offered support and sent engineering support, air aviation assets, and other support. So it was just a magnificent operation. And one of my few regrets is that I didn't get a chance to more fulsomely communicate to Australians about the achievements of the ADF and the Defence personnel, because almost to the day when we closed Operation Bushfire Assist, we opened Operation COVID-19 Assist. And that has now become the largest domestic operation in our nation's history.
I think in both cases, one of the things I was struck by, quite moved by in a sense, was the trust that Australians have in the defence organisation. They wanted people in uniform to be there. They liked it. It's not like this was in any way seen to be threatening or unpleasant that you would have military people out on the streets assisting Australians. Is Defence ever going to be in a position where it will be able to do less, or do you think these roles are now going to just be a larger part of Defence going forward?
Look, that's a great question, and it's one that we turned our mind to regularly, because it's very clear that we have the capability to assist states and territories, which again some people lost sight of, that we weren't conducting a coup. We actually had to be invited in by states and territories to come in and undertake these roles, and I think we've developed that process incredibly well with states and territories. So, the disaster management processes now work very well in that sense. But, we are living in incredibly uncertain geostrategic times, which has been further exacerbated and exploited by others during COVID-19. So it is always a matter of balance, and that's what we're turning our mind to, is how can we do that and provide that support, but still not detract Defence from its primary role of defending our nation. So I think it will be a constant balance, and it'll be a balance that needs to be explained publicly. So it is a matter of balance, but with climate change and we've just seen here in Western Australia a cyclone that has come further south than ever before. So things are changing,
yes.
And the Defence has to change.
The roles for Defence will multiply. Just on the COVID experience, I thought an interesting development that happened both with you and the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister was what I call COVID diplomacy.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden, to everyone's great surprise, we can't move around the world anymore, or have the kind of contact which is a very intense part of a Defence Minister's experience.
Yeah.
And what happened was that you ended up, like I guess we all did, doing Zooms and secure Zooming and that type of thing. What was that experience like for you? Because it seemed to me, we did a pretty good job of sustaining those relationships and actually building some at the same time.
One of the things I'm proudest of was not only I went in with, I think, quite a clear idea of what I wanted to do with the strategy capability and the transformation processes and the budget, but I made defence diplomacy my second major priority, because it was very clear to me and the government that no one nation, and certainly no one nation amongst our allies and friends, regionally and globally, can go it alone, and that to retain the rules-based order and to retain the security and the security and the prosperity, which we've talked about before, but go together to support a democracy. That all of these relationships with like-mindeds, not necessarily those we share values with, because obviously not every country is a democracy as we would see it, but those relationships with our friends and trusted partners was incredibly important. So I think I did end up doing nearly 140 counterpart meetings in the pre-COVID. Everything's pre-COVID, post-COVID, but pre-COVID there was something like 8 visits overseas and 12 countries visited. The large forums like Shangri-La, the Munich Security Dialogue, the ASEAN meetings, all incredibly important opportunities to further develop our multilateral relationships. So I had the opportunity with the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting to have I was the first ever minister to have a +1 meeting with the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting. Our ASEAN vision was very well received openly by ASEAN counterparts. Signed a new agreement early on with NATO and had a lot of engagement, not just with the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, but with a number of their member nations. Obviously, the ones that we have defence capability, sovereign relationships with now, but also with others. And over my time, the shift, it was very, very clear from my first visit to NATO to sort of second and third meetings, was that their focus had shifted from Russia and it was now Russia, China, and what is happening, the strategic competition between the United States and China in our region. So they were looking to us, very much looking to us for our perspective on what was happening in our region. So there was sort of NATO and, again, ASEAN, the South Pacific Defence Ministers meeting, it was an important forum. So minilaterals, multilaterals are incredibly important. And as we work, it's like a web of relationships. And of course, the Quad was a very important development in the defence sphere during my time.
Are there one or two personal relationships that you developed that sort of became particularly close over your time as Minister with counterparts internationally?
Yes, several. I enjoyed a really great working relationship with Mark Esper, who was the US Defence Secretary. And for most of my time as Minister for Defence, we developed a really great relationship and we were very like-minded. So together we re-enlivened the Five Eyes Defence Ministers meeting program. We agreed at my second OSMIN a very ambitious 10-year plan for our defence relationship, next 10-year plan for force posture, for supply chains, for the enhancement of our industrial bases, including doing more what would have been traditionally seen as a sovereign industrial base work, but how could we operationalise the NTIB?
Yes.
Do more munitions production here, including now looking at precision guided munitions as well. So that relationship was very warm, and and we're still in contact with the Japanese minister. And so Taro, we had a great relationship, sort of communicated and worked well together multilaterally as well as bilaterally. We made significant progress in that relationship, and that extended to Minister Kishi-san when he became the new minister. And I was the first visitor during COVID, to visit, and again, we made some very good progress. So, Florence Parley, for example, we've got a very warm relationship. We obviously work very closely together on the submarine program and on getting some contractual changes, which were pretty much there by the time I'd left. But again, that wasn't easy for on either side to get those changes. But again, we were in formal and informal contact, and it was a good relationship.
I'd like to look just very quickly at each of those three relationships: the US, the Japanese, and France. And I think in some respects, at a surface level, when it came to dealing with the US of the Trump administration, there was some concern about what impact would the quirkiness of Trump have on the bilateral relationship. But actually, the OSMIN communiques that I saw during your time as minister were some of the most substantive in terms of practical cooperation that happened and is still happening.
Yes.
So, for example, a lot of what we're now seeing publicly about enhanced cooperation for the manufacturing of missiles, the sort of shared Australian and US effort that may emerge from that, was largely the result of a number of the discussions that you'd had with Mark Esper and also Maurice had with her counterpart in state. So even when the White House might be something of a challenge, the interesting thing about the Australia-US relationship is that it sort of works very effectively at ministerial level.
Look, it does, and so the OSMIN, the COVID OSMIN, where Minister Payne and I went to Washington, I was the first visitor to the Pentagon and she was the first international visitor to the State Department. And it was much scaled down, so the four of us had the benefit of sort of over 12 months of intense engagement and discussions and agreement. So all four of us were actually focused in our respective lanes on delivery. So when we got to Washington, it actually meant a great deal to the Americans as well, because we were the first visitors who had gone there. But it built on a very strong base. So The meetings themselves were much scaled down.
Right.
So, instead of having these really large tables where we're sort of, at a long distance, they were small, narrow tables. So we spent many, many more hours together at meetings, at dinners, at drinks. So it got to the point where, you have your official speaking points and you normally go through the agenda. By the time we actually got to the formal agenda, we'd pretty much discussed all of these things. So we had a really warm and productive discussion where it was much more wide-ranging. And then by the end of it, we'd realised we'd covered off all of our agenda items and we had actually got everything, that collectively we wanted.
Yes.
But that only comes when you have, personal relationships, I think, and trust, not only between Prime Minister and a President, but also between counterparts.
Worth paying the price for having to isolate after you got back?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And of course, the other country where Australian ministers were prepared to pay that price was Japan.
Yes.
And the interesting thing there is how quickly not only the bilateral relationship, but the Australia-US-Japan trilateral relationship has come along as well.
During my 2 years, nearly 2 years, it has come a long way. So I had 2 visits with Minister Connor, and we had a really great, really enjoyed his company. And again, that was that mix of social events where we, got an opportunity to discuss issues and have a bit of a laugh, exchange gifts. And my gift to him on the first visit was a quokka, so quokka-san, who became a Twitter sensation in Japan.
Not a live quokka, I trust.
No,
okay.
no.
What about that?
But it was, and it was just, he literally became a Twitter sensation in Japan.
Right.
And so it's those moments that you get to build on. And then when you need to get down to the business, end of our relationship, Japan and Australia, and particularly coming as a West Australian, we've had such a long relationship with Japan, and we share the same democratic values. We share the same adherence to democratic principles, and we share a region. So, and we share a relationship with the United States. So it is a natural friendship, as is ours with South Korea. So relationship with 2 ministers has progressed a lot. I welcomed, the previous minister to Australia, and been in close contact. And there is much more that we can do with the Republic of Korea, and I think both of us now are looking at new opportunities to do that.
Yes.
So, and I know that that's something that Peter Dutton will now progress. But again, it's a logical friendship.
Yes.
In terms of issues and values.
On France, submarines, I guess, is the number one item on any agenda of discussion, although, of course, France is part of the region. France has an Indo-Pacific strategy, so a long-term strategic partner. But it fell to you to deal with a pretty difficult period of negotiation with the French on the submarines.
Look, it was, but again, it was the relationship between Florence Parly and myself was very strong. We developed a good partnership, and we could have honest and frank discussions with each other. But on a program of that size, it's important to both sovereign nations. There was a lot of things to discuss, and there still are. But there was goodwill on both sides. But again, it was working through how you amend the contract to satisfy both. And we got to that point. So we agreed early on, we agreed on the 60%, but then the devil is always in the detail, particularly when you've got to amend a contract.
Yes, 60% of course being domestic Australian
yes.
content in the program, which has now been not simply agreed in verbally, but formally agreed in the updated contract as well. Do you think we're now into sort of plain sailing on the program?
Look, something that large and that complex, as I'm sure some of my predecessors would have said with the Collins, for example, this is the largest and most complex capability acquisition program Australia has ever entered into, and it is certainly the longest.
Yes.
So it was important, and one of the things that was very clear to me early on is that we needed to get the design right. to learn from the Collins class program in terms of the build and the sustainment, in terms of the early problems with the Air Warfare Destroyer project, which has now delivered 3 magnificent air warfare destroyers. So to learn those lessons and to put them not just into the build of the submarine, the future submarine, but also the 69 other classes of vessels that we are now building here, we will be building here in Australia. So it is tough, but it should be tough.
Yes.
When you take sovereign partners to design and then to transfer IP, their sovereign IP, to your nation, it's always going to be difficult. Yeah. But it was still the right decision, I believe. Yeah.
So, Linda, one of the big things that happened during your time was the production of a strategic update, which a lot of people now are describing as really a defence white paper and everything by name. And with the update came a force structure plan, and then a few months after that came your defence reorganisation strategy as well. So three quite big pieces of policy work. Take us through the strategic update, because it was really dealing with some of the biggest and toughest strategic changes Australia's seen in decades.
The fact that it was necessary so soon after the last white paper, I think, says a lot about the changes in our geostrategic circumstances, particularly in our region. So when I came into the portfolio, I set, in the first month, I set 3 priorities for Defence's leadership, so Defence and the ADF's leadership: strategy, capability and reform. So I knew that we needed to have a look at a lot of the assumptions that underpinned the white paper, because it was very clear to me and to many others that some of those assumptions, including a 10-year warning time for major conflict, had most likely changed. Yeah. So the whole range of those sort of assumptions and just changed circumstances that were very apparent. So we did the strategic review process, which led to the strategic update. And I think it is a very clear-eyed assessment, an honest assessment of our circumstances. I think, 8 months after that, I think it's probably we need to do, have a look at some of the assumptions that were underpinning the update. So rather than being, a fire and forget sort of a document, as a white paper, I think given technological transformation, the militarisation of our region, all those and the many other factors that are changing and evolving far more rapidly than they have in the past, needs us to be more agile with our strategic review, because if we don't keep reviewing our strategy, and if it is not honest, then we will be structuring a defence force to potentially fight conflicts of the past. And so the strategic update was very well received, I think, domestically and also internationally. Had very good responses from our allies and partners, sometimes openly and very publicly, and others just in one-on-one meetings that, they understood it. Regional partners understood it wasn't about them, but it was about some of the broader sort of issues and contestation in our region. So the focus, I think the focus on lethality is not something we like to talk about in Australia. Polite company in Australia doesn't really talk about lethality, but that was important to acknowledge. And if we're going to arm ourselves and equip ourselves, not just with capability for soft power, but for conflict, then we need to be honest about our circumstances. So that was very important to myself, but also to Defence's leadership, that we did that. So that was the strategic update. And the companion piece to that, as you know, was a force structure plan, which again I think is probably the most comprehensive capability plan that we've had, certainly in living memory. That was completely tied to delivering the Defence strategic update. So what I'm most proud of in that document is not only did we look to completely re-equip Army, Air Force and Navy, so land, maritime and air capability, but also we created 2 new military capability domains to deal with probably the 2 most existential threats that we have. One is cyber, and cyber and information warfare, but also with space. Both of them are still, particularly cyber, not so much information warfare, but cyber and space, are still quite nascent military capabilities in terms of defence. That doesn't preclude anything about what the Australian Signals Directorate does, but we have a lot more to be done in that cyber defence and offensive cyber. But the domain that I think we need most work on is space. The Australian Space Agency is a great thing and has been beautifully led by Megan Clark, but our defence space capabilities does need more attention. So I think we've now got that capability plan, and most importantly, we've got it funded. So I was very proud and relieved to have actually got the $575 billion locked in over the next decade, because history has shown us that a white paper or a capability plan is just a piece of paper if you don't have the money to deliver it, but also you need the organisation to deliver it. And again, in the transformation plan, which is something that I drove, I think it's safe to say that not everybody in defence was enthusiastic about the process, but there was, we didn't have any contractors, so this was a defence-led process for defence. And I was very proud of that piece of work, and I'm hopeful that enough people within the organisation understand how important it is to have a stronger strategic centre, to have a stronger contracting centre, to deal with, currently we've got over 200 major capability programs underway, with more coming, and you need to take a programmatic approach like we're doing with the shipbuilding plan, but for land capability, for air capability, for cyber, ICT, so that you've got that long-term programmatic view of capability and they're managed that way. So all of that, I think you can't have one without, you won't deliver the strategy without the capability plan, the funding and the means to deliver.
Yes. To manage any big transformation exercise, which is what we're really talking about here, you have to have a really effective relationship with the Secretary and the Chief of Defence Force. How did that work out for you?
I really enjoyed working with both. I knew both from different parts of my life and my sort of previous careers. So we had, all three of us had a pre-existing relationships. We wouldn't have got as much done. It would have been impossible to have delivered what we delivered, particularly during COVID, bushfires, without a strong working relationship. It didn't mean we didn't have some robust discussions on occasion, or that all three of us didn't, always saw eye to eye. Of course we didn't. But again, the relationship works if you have trust, and you either have trust because you've already got pre-existing relationships, or you develop that trust over time.
Yes. Of course, all of this happens in a background context of an exceptionally high workflow. What was that like as Minister? What was a sort of a daily workload like for you in the job?
It's a bit bonkers, to put it in a colloquial expression. But just to give you an idea, so I've picked out some statistics before this interview. So over the course of my nearly 2 years, I signed just under 4,000 briefs on issues, that ranged across operations, the national intelligence community, everything. 200 capability projects. I had 122 cabinet level meetings during that time. Nearly 1,000, just over 1,300 questions on notice to clear from the Parliament. 2,000 pieces of correspondence. I took 80 submissions through the National NSC and the NSIC, successfully, I might add. I had 187 meetings with key stakeholders across the portfolio, so defence industry, diplomats, and I had nearly 140 meetings with international counterparts, sort of multilaterally and bilaterally. Many of which were in this, last year and the year of COVID, were virtually.
Yes, Yes, that's an astonishing volume. Just the
And that's just a little snapshot.
The throughput to be able to deal with all of that.
And then there was the two largest operations in our nation's history, Operation Bushfire Assist and Operation COVID-19 Assist, which still continues.
Yes. Two things that I want to talk about, which I guess were pretty difficult elements of the portfolio. One was dealing with the Brereton review into the allegations of war crimes on the part of some Special Forces soldiers in Afghanistan. And there is a process which is now going to ensure that each of those issues that will be looked at independently and go through judicial consideration. What was it like dealing with that as Minister?
That was probably the most challenging issue for me personally, ethically and leadership-wise. So through all of those prisms, it was, on reflection, the most challenging issue for me in the portfolio. I knew it was coming. It had been 4.5, I think nearly 5 years in the making. I'd certainly I'd talked to a number of people over many months about what might be in the report, and it was very clear to me that it was going to be worse than most Australians would have thought possible, and certainly it would be incredibly challenging, and I think it was all of that and more.
Yeah.
So I've read the report. I hadn't read the names, so I didn't have the names because I didn't want names to be identified. But it was very, very confronting. So the Prime Minister and I had, before the release of the report by the Chief of Defence Force, we had worked out the government response and process, because it was very clear that these were matters that were going to go on for many years. So we established the Office of the Special Investigator, the government did, which now has, I think, something like 70 investigators, and will work through over many years through the Australian criminal justice process and due process, and all of those things under the Australian justice system will apply to that. The second process that I established was an independent oversight panel led by Vivienne Tom, because I understood that it was going to be very important to ensure that there was transparency in how Defence itself dealt with the issues that arose from that report. How it had happened for so long and got worse over time in terms of the behaviours, and how did it happen and what were the root causes. Obviously, it's a very contemporaneous issue. So it was very clear to me that there would need to be a process that the public could have confidence in, and that I and subsequent ministers could have confidence in, that the organisation was undergoing the self-analysis and also the reforms that it needed to do for all of the reasons that have been publicly discussed.
Yes. Of course, the second thing was the circumstances which ultimately led to you leaving the portfolio, which kind of, I suppose, as can happen in politics, a maelstrom emerges out of a blue sky and you find yourself having to deal with, in this case, very complicated and difficult sexual harassment allegations on the part of a former member of staff. What's that like when it happens, Linda? I mean, it must have been a dreadful experience.
I'm not sure it's over yet, Peter, so I'm not quite sure how much I could or should say. But as you said, that's politics. And look, the issues that have arisen because of that are incredibly important, and they're issues that I'm incredibly passionate about.
Yes.
I've worked in and around Parliament House for 30 years. And as a young female staffer, I saw things through my own eyes and those of my friends. And the culture and behaviour in that place have needed reform for a long time. It's a complex workplace, like no other in many ways than any other workplace. But it is incredibly important that we do seek change. Yeah. And it's not just in Parliament House. So having gone through the project review and the reforms that continue today in Defence, I learnt a lot about that, and I've been tireless in my efforts in the Liberal Party to get change on gender, because we do need reform and change, just like I think every other organisation in this nation has needed to do. So the issue itself is incredibly important. It hasn't been the easiest time for myself and my family, but it's been a salutary reminder to me that just once we become elected, we don't become superhuman. Is that we are still subject to the same health conditions that we were before elected, the same stresses and strains on ourselves and our family. So it has been just a very salutary reminder of the pressures of the workplace, because things that are said in that chamber, things that have been said to me in that chamber, nobody else could say in any other workplace. It just you just wouldn't be allowed. So look, we've got a long way to go on this issue, I think, federally. But again, I think the Prime Minister has done a really great thing with the task force. He's listening, he's consulting, and like every other leader who goes through this process, and I saw it in the military, and other male champions of change, when their organisations go through this, in that sense, we're no different in politics. It's time that we go through this journey. We're a bit later to start than many other organisations, but it is never too late.
Yes. Well, Linda, as you think about your future, all strength to your arm to continue that, working on those challenges to make a better workplace in Parliament House. I think for everyone that's in it, that's really important stuff. And I hope also that you think back with some measure of satisfaction at the tremendous things that happened during your time in the portfolio as well, that it shouldn't be marked just by the circumstances that led to you moving positions. So thanks very much for talking to us. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Peter, and I look forward to continuing to engage with ASPI.
Thank you.